talk is I am an energy information singularity, and it actually allows you to grab all it does afford. Now think about it this way. Remember I said I'm just a bunch of chemicals. I'm an unfolding wave of energy information. Okay, and I'm going to suggest that a concept of energy information is one of those ontological concepts that affords, if we're going to go to the bottom, okay, those are two pretty good words that get you to the bottom on the one hand. Now, of course, you and I are in 100% agreement that you will not explain the world from the bottom without emergence and emanation.
Yes.
But we certainly don't want to stop at chemicals or quarks. But energy information is actually an interesting place to bottom out on, and it can be a fun place to bottom out on as you climb back up.
Yeah, and I want to, a lot of my argument actually runs off the idea of needing information to be real.
Exactly.
In a very fundamental way in your own
In a very fundamental way. And energy's pretty real, too.
Well, the two are inseparable from each other in an important way. Especially if when you get down to the bottom level and all you're talking about probability distributions, and then where's the fire in the equation? Where does the actuality come from?
So Greg Henriquez and John Vervaeke are treating us to another round of cognitive science videos. I just watched the first episode in this new season, let's call it, and I really enjoyed it. It was titled Transcendental Naturalism. I'll drop a link in my description here. And they're searching for a new framework or convergence between each of their frameworks to help us deal with the meaning crisis. And John was exploring in this first video what he's calling extended naturalism. And he's trying to move beyond both reductionism or scientific materialism on the one hand, and also a kind of decadent romanticism, right? And so the materialist says everything's only particles. The romanticist says everything is soul, and is very easily captured by the sort of contemporary consumer culture, where it's more about how you identify on the inside than what you do or how others see you. And this retreat, this decadent romanticism is a kind of retreat from social life on the one hand, but also, while it pretends to a kind of deeper communion with nature, is actually only communing with an idea of nature, the beautiful part, and not the struggle for existence part. And we need to chart a middle path between these two extremes, right? The decadent romanticism and the reductionistic materialism. Now, I do think, and I hope to talk to John and Greg about this, that there is, and John himself hinted at this, that's why he specified decadent romanticism, that there is a deeper sense in which, romanticism as a literary, philosophical, spiritual, cultural movement, artistic movement, is of abiding value. I think just as much as we would want to inherit the spirit of the Enlightenment, we would want to inherit the soul of romanticism as part, as what we would maybe still want to call a Western cultural identity. We would want to inherit both of these streams, right? The Romantic and the Enlightenment, as in some ways codependently, well, maybe they are codependently arising. I was going to say dependently co-arising to avoid the psychological connotation there, but in some sense, maybe that's more appropriate. The psyche deals in polarities, right? Jung taught us this. One of them is the polarity between the self and the world, the ego and the cosmos, and Jung sometimes remains a little bit too Kantian, but when he starts talking about synchronicity and alchemy and astrology and all the rest of it, getting into Gnosticism, Book of Job, his answer to Job, I think he begins to recognize the true polarity here between psyche and cosmos, and isn't simply reducing nature to the soul. He's actually saying that the soul is nature too, or that the soul and nature are one, whichever way you want to say it. And so Jung is a romantic, in the 20th century. And I think it's still possible to recover a healthy romanticism. We can't do so while rejecting everything about the Enlightenment, because that's obviously one-sided and unhealthy and becomes pathological. So we want to reject either extreme, right? We're not just particles and chemistry, and nor are we just souls. So when John was talking about his extended naturalism, he was saying he wants to take science seriously, the hard sciences, physics, chemistry, biology. But he thinks that whenever we want to offer explanations, particularly of the social, psychological, and indeed the spiritual levels of reality, we're not going to be able to do so just in terms of physics, chemistry, and biology. So culture isn't just an epiphenomenon floating ghost-like on top of nature. Consciousness isn't just a ghost or an epiphenomenon in the brain. There is real downward causation. There is real emergence, and there's also emanation. And here, John's trying to resurrect, resuscitate, or just give voice to a tradition that's always, so long as we've been philosophizing, been with us, the Platonic tradition. And I would be happy to refer, and have referred to myself as a Neoplatonist. So there's a leveled ontology that John wants to add to naturalism, and that's I think more than, in my terms, more than just an extension of naturalism. It's I think we have to say an overturning, because naturalism is opposing itself to what? Spiritualism. Well, if we're going to take spiritual transcendence seriously, then I think we're better off not referring to our ontology as either naturalism or spiritualism, but as some other, more general term. Because the problem with naturalism, I think, is that, well, how do we define it? Usually it's defined as implying causal closure, right? There are no transcendent causes. Everything that happens for an imminent reason. There's no outside influence on the system. No energy is created, energy is conserved, and there's also a kind of entropy. There's a running down, there's a dispersion of whatever somehow was centrated, which is the interesting problem for the materialist cosmologist to try to work out, is why the early universe was so low entropy, such that still today, 14 billion years later, if we take the Big Bang model as our reigning cosmological interpretation, 14 billion years later, there's still complexity emerging. There's still some kind of counteragency working in the opposite direction to dispersion. There's more centration happening, right? New stars are still being born. And we could play out what we think the universe will do a billion years from now based on what we think the universe was doing a billion years ago, but that's based on a model, and we can't really be sure of this. So, the problem with naturalism, I think, is that it's actually at a cosmological scale, it's pretty damn speculative. And many physicists, I think Eddington admitted, that the laws of thermodynamics are the most metaphysical of the physical laws. We don't really know if energy is conserved. We assume it is and do experiments based on that, and most times it seems to work, but do we know that that's true everywhere in the universe? I mean, what is dark energy? It seems like it's causing an acceleration of the rate of expansion. I mean, this is what the model says. How is that accelerate? That seems like new energy is being introduced into the system, doesn't it? I mean, just, I guess, what do I know? I'm not a physicist, but I think naturalism is too closed down of a picture to actually account for the sort of creativity that we see at work. Well, first of all, in our own thinking activity as those, as minds who are seeking for scientific knowledge and to justify the scientific method. There's a lot of creativity in the biosphere as a whole that's very much unlike the kind of mechanical system, that Newton was trying to study. Life, or that, the 19th century physicists studying thermodynamics and, steam engines. Life is creative. Life solves problems. Life invents new problems for itself to solve. And life is not just about the struggle of individuals for supremacy. I mean, life from the very beginning has been a collective, communal affair where, one moment you think you're dealing with a single organism and the next moment you realize it's actually either part of some larger swarm or is itself a communal composition. An organism, an animal made of many cells, an animal made of animals, and this, nested doll kind of architecture is impossible to study as if it were deterministic, right? As if it were just simply about algorithmic rule following. There's not just rule following in the biosphere. There's rule making, right? And this is not something that just humans do. It's not merely that, somehow this culture magic stuff allows us to be capable of making our own rules. Nature is already in the business of making its own rules, right? The laws of physics, to the extent that they are effective, are realized by the entities composing the physical world, right? So the laws emerge from the interactivity of the agent events that compose the actual world, rather than laws being imposed from eternity upon a merely material world. Laws are constraints, right? But the thing about a constraint, I would suggest, is that it's a top-down diversion of energy, and in this sense, it's kind of breaking causal closure. And I mean, we don't need to freak out about that and say, oh my God, that's some kind of supernatural transcendent cause reaching in from the beyond. No, I mean, the only reason a physical universe exists at all is because of a symmetry break. And so we know this happens. If the math was all there was, it would all be symmetrical and nothing would be happening. But here we are, and so when we try to understand how we got here, I think obviously emergence and emergent constraints, which then begin to be better explained perhaps in terms of an emanation, or maybe better to say simultaneously explained in a convergent way, in terms of emanation. We can approach it either way, right? Emergence or emanation. But these constraints at these different emergent or emanational levels divert the flow of energy. At least divert it. They might even be creating energy. And what would that mean? I mean, that's what agency would mean. And if we're going to say that information is real and that energy actually is information, information is defined as difference, essential difference, or a difference that makes a difference, as Gregory Bateson would put it. And, of course, if it makes a difference, it makes a difference to somebody. And so if we're dealing in an informational ontology, we may as well be talking about panexperientialism, I would suggest. And, that means that, in Whitehead's terms, there's a mental pull. Whenever we're talking about energetic process, we're not just talking about a physical process. There's a mental pull. And at that simplest level of just electromagnetic radiation, Whitehead would say the mental pull is very diminished and manifests in the form of vibration. And the fact that you do get this sort of reversion that happens in a waveform for Whitehead is suggestive of the germ of mind, of some aesthetic sense at the very base of nature, of the physical world. Right at the lowest level, what do we see? Rhythm. What enables life to emerge out of chemistry? Rhythm. What allows mind to emerge out of life? Rhythm. Right? And it's rhythms upon rhythms upon rhythms. It's information flow. There's a mental pull at work. There are not just physical causes, there are conceptual causes. And as soon as we admit that, I don't think causal closure is defensible anymore. And so to the extent that naturalism is defined as causal closure, then I don't know that we can keep being naturalists. Now, I want to take natural science seriously, but when it's a question of ontology or even just cosmology, I think we need to be willing to accept that science and philosophy are kind of on the same ground at that point. Like, we can't do an experiment on the universe as a whole. We can take some measurements, and I think we should pay very close attention to them, but there are many, many interpretations of when we're talking about cosmological observations. There are way more interpretations and way fewer observations to go on. I mean, there's still 40 some odd interpretations of gravity that are empirically indistinguishable from Einstein's, but in terms of the underlying ontology, quite different from one another. Whitehead has his own alternative to Einstein's theory of gravity, right? So I think we need to accept the speculative nature of cosmology, which doesn't mean it's totally detached from the empirical. Again, we need to be tied to the observations, but so often nowadays in cosmology, physical cosmology, you don't even get the observation, you get the theoretical interpretation of the observation as a fact. Like the Big Bang, for example, is often just talked about as a fact. Redshift is talked about as expansion. The fact is the observation of the redshift. We don't observe expansion, that's a theoretical interpretation. There's other interpretations like tired light and other things. And so I think we need to be, I would want to be more cautious about, signing up for naturalism, because the question then becomes like, well, which science at which moment in history, in which institutional context, which disciplinary context are we talking about? Because there's a plurality of sciences, and the physicists don't even agree with each other about how to interpret quantum theory. Is there even a quantum theory? I mean, Many have disputed that. So I think, I don't know, I wouldn't want to hitch my boat to naturalism necessarily. But I do like this idea that energy and information are interchangeable, convertible, if you want. I mean, it's a new kind of E equals MC squared, right? It's, yes, mass is energy and energy is information. But do we mean syntactic information, or do we mean semantic information? Can the two be separated? Can language and thought be separated? And when we do bring information into our ontology, we're also bringing communication into our ontology, and I think that's super significant for the spiritual side of all of this, because in terms of the relationship between ritual and rationality, right? If we have a communicative ontology, or, I mean, I'm really just trying to use another way of talking about an informational ontology, then the Eucharist, communion, becomes, I think, deeply meaningful, not just as a way of communing with the divine, but also as a means of understanding analogically the very nature of reality, because to eat is to recognize that you too are food, will be food one day, and is to recognize that, to drink is to recognize that you are a whirlpool and a flow of energy, and to breathe is to recognize that you are dependent upon, interdependent with a larger body. You belong to a larger body. Such is life, right? This is the nested architecture I was talking about earlier. And I think this is where scientific knowledge and spiritual wisdom connect. This is where understanding and compassion can coincide, when we recognize the theology that's enfolded right there in our biology, when we recognize that, in the shape of our bodies materially, the syntax, we can read a spiritual semantics. I think that's the kind of synthesis that I would want to search for, to really rediscover the sense of nature as a book, and we can read it because we too are nature. And I think this is important for our civilization and for the earth as well. I don't think this whole project that spirit, or consciousness, if you prefer, has been engaged in on this planet for the last tens of thousands of years is just a kind of accident. I think, the earth always was a seed, and we're not the only flower, but I think the fruit of this whole planetary process is something that we are at least important participants in helping to manifest. And so I hope that, we can avert catastrophe by avoiding this splitting into these two extremes of greedy reductionism and decadent romanticism. I hope we can chart the middle path, and I think Greg and John are helping to draw that map and to help us navigate. So yeah, thanks to both of them for what they're contributing, and I look forward to continuing the conversation.